Our second reading this evening comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 51, verses 1 through 6. And if you would like to follow along, that can be found on page 667 in your pew Bibles. Listen again for God to speak. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you that seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn and the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who bore you. For he was but one when I called him. But I blessed him and made him many. For the Lord will comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places and will make her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song. Listen to me, my people, and give heed to me, my nation, for a teaching will go out from me, and my justice for a light to the peoples. I will bring near my deliverance swiftly. My salvation has gone out, and my arms will rule the peoples. The coastlands wait for me, and for my arm they hope. Lift up your eyes to the heavens, and look at the earth beneath. For the heavens will vanish like smoke, the earth will wear out like a garment, and those who live on it will die like gnats, but my salvation will be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. God always blesses the reading and the hearing of his word and those who keep it. The world is full of sound. Even when there is nothing to record it, sound waves are being emitted. Now, some sounds are subtle, but others are abrupt. Some sounds are pleasing to the ear, while other sounds can literally cause us pain. Louis Caliani, author and dialect coach, wrote, "Sound has a profound effect on the senses. It can be both heard and felt. It can even be seen with the mind's eye. It can almost be tasted and smelled. Sound can evoke responses from the five senses." Now, you and I are no strangers to the effect sound can have upon us. We've all heard sounds that can bring back memories, sounds that can bring us comfort, sounds that startle us, and sounds that can even move us to tears. And sometimes, the overabundance of sounds in our world is so overwhelming that they become a collective noise and lose their distinctive effect. And sometimes that noise is found in the voices and stories we hear pouring in from our news channels and our favorite social media outlets. That noise is heard and felt in the disagreements and the vitriol over agendas and policies. That noise comes from the cynicism over the way things are, as well as the pessimism that says things will never change. It will only get worse. And we lose ourselves in the noise, and we become numb even to the stories that should move us to action. And this noise can be both felt and heard. It can be seen with the mind's eye. It can almost be tasted and smelled. And how noise can affect and evoke responses of the five senses. Do you ever feel like there's just too much noise? I must confess that sometimes the noise is so loud that I cannot hear my own voice, let alone the voice of the divine. The noise can get so loud that it is hard to hear the sounds of hope in a world that seems so full of despair. Yes, the world is full of noise. And there are reasons for lament, that's for certain. One cannot see the images of the things that are happening in Ferguson, in Iraq, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and the list could go on and on. One cannot see those things without longing for peace. One cannot hear the news of another young death, another suicide, another painful diagnosis without praying for mercy. One cannot learn about oppression, inequality, discrimination, and violence without crying out for justice. And within the struggle, there seems to be no song of hope. It can feel as though we are stuck. And this is especially true when the loudest voices want us to believe that this is just the way things are and the way things will always be. And granted, if we are honest with ourselves, I think we would all admit that there are times when it can be difficult to see another way or to hear any other news but bad news. But as people of faith, we must not allow ourselves to remain there. There's another story into which we are called to participate. In another time and in another place, the people were overwhelmed by sounds of despair and songs of hopelessness. The people of Israel had been taken into captivity by the Babylonian Empire in the 6th century BC, and they were removed from their homeland, which had been destroyed by their invaders and now lay desolate and deserted. A land that once held so much promise, a land that represented their past, a land that was supposed to hold their future was now a wasteland and a distant memory. The people had been forced to leave their land and all of the things that were familiar to them. There was reason for lament, that is for certain. And those people were held in captivity for 2 generations. And understandably, they had lost their identity and could only hear the sounds of despair, the noise of the voices who were convinced that this was the way it was always going to be. They had lost the sound of faith, and they grieved a dry, barren, deserted land void of hope. They lived lives void of good news, void of a song. And it was into this context that the voice of the prophet rings out with a different song in what is often called 2nd Isaiah. The prophet cries out, encouraging the people to hear a different sound than the one that had been dominating their everyday lives. And of the role of the prophet, Abraham Heschel, noted Jewish theologian, author, and activist of the middle of the 20th century, writes, "The prophet's ear perceives the silent sigh. While others are intoxicated with the here and now, the prophet has a vision of an end." And he continues, and the prophet's task is exhortation, not mere prediction. And that's what we have in the beginning of Isaiah 51. It's a text written to the exiled people. And the end that the prophet sees is one of divine purpose. He employs notes that are 1 octave too high for our ears. And the prophet of Isaiah 51 speaks a sound that was rooted in their past and would prove to shape the future into which they were called to walk together. It was a sound of hope, rooted in the covenantal promise of God. And our text, Isaiah 51, verse 1, begins with a familiar imperative for the people of Israel to listen. Listen. And upon hearing this, those listening to the prophet's voice may have been reminded of a passage that we call the Shema, Deuteronomy 6. This passage has shaped the faith and community life for our Jewish sisters and brothers for literally millennia. It begins with the same imperative in Hebrew, Shema, and that's where it gets its name. And that word is translated listen or hear. And it reads, "Listen, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And it's this passage that is written on the hearts and the door frames of their homes even today. It's the song they sing when they sit and when they rise and when they walk together along the way. And in our text this morning, the prophet calls out to the people, these same people, those who pursue righteousness, people of faith. The prophet cries out to listen once again. They're to open their ears and hear a different voice, a different sound in the midst of the noise of their real despair. And what is it that this prophet is calling his hearers to heed? It's a message to look. To look beyond the desperation of their current circumstances, back into the lives of those who had gone before them. The prophet calls his hearers to look to God's activity. The prophet calls the people not only to listen and remember who they are, but he calls them to consider the promises fulfilled in their past. Promises that grew out of the original covenant made with their common ancestors, Abraham and Sarah. And with the same imperative strength that begins this passage, the prophet cries out to the people to look to the rock from which you were hewn and the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father and Sarah who bore you, for he was but one when I called him. But I blessed him and made him many. According to Hebrew scholar Walter Brueggemann, the exiles are to recall the ancestors in order to ponder the memory of Yahweh, who gives miraculous blessing to this people in the most unlikely circumstances. And this theme, if you pay attention, is echoed over and over and over again in the story of Israel. God acts in decisive and mighty ways within even the most dire of circumstances, even within a barren land. When hope seems dashed upon the craggy rocks of their present reality, they were to look back to the divine activity of promise. The God who has acted, is acting now, and will act yet again. And this knowledge of the past activity of a mighty God should give people of faith, all people who pursue faith, confidence that this same God will continue to follow this same pattern. God made flowers bloom in the desert once before. The prophet reminds those held in captivity that this same God will make the desert wilderness into a blooming Eden paradise once again, where now there is only lament and a barren wasteland. God will bring the beautiful sound of songs of joy and the sweet fragrance of blossoms of hope. And the prophet's words do not end there. The hearer, the reader, hears the same imperative that began the passage once again. Listen. And this time, we, are to pay attention to the teaching that will pour out from the mouth of the Lord. A teaching rooted in the justice of the Lord that will be a light for all people. The heavens and the earth will pass away, says the prophet, as will those who inhabit it. But the way things are will not be the way things will always be. God's salvation will be forever, and God's divine deliverance will never end. God has acted in the past, and God's activity will never end in spite of the gravity of our current circumstances. And these are the assurances that are not only meant to buoy the people of God, but also to serve as a beacon of hope for all people. In the midst of deep despair and the loud noise of hopelessness, it is easy to forget that the promises of God will never change. the all-inclusiveness of God's grace rings out. The mission given to the exiles is to carry the message of God's compassion, justice, and truth. Israel's covenant with God was to be a light and a blessing to all people. The way of God was shining through the people of God, even in the midst of the cacophony of the noise in which they lived. In many ways, the church, the whole church, has lost itself in the noise of bad news. We not only hear the bad news of our culture, but we also hear the voices that tell us that the church is dying. We hear the opinions of others that there is nothing that the church can do about it. I don't want to minimize the despair and the pain and the discouragement felt by such news. Those feelings are real. However, there's a different sound. It's a sound that has never ceased. It's a sound of hope from a covenantal God who speaks words of promise through the voices of those who have gone before us. Ron Allen, one of my professors from CTS, wrote this: "Robbed of memory, everyone is a stranger to us, and we are strangers to ourselves. A forgetful community is no longer aware of what it is about, what its purpose is, or whom it loves." It's time to listen to the words of the prophet who calls us to hear a different way. I know the world gets so noisy that we can no longer hear the word of God, and we need someone to hear it for us. And this is where the voice of the prophet breaks through the noise to speak a word of truth, giving us hope that there is a different way. One author wrote, "The perceptive ear of faith will still hear God's voice in spite of screaming cynicism and doubt, reminding us that God's salvation is sure and eternal, even outlasting all of creation." The following passage is found in a captivating small book entitled, "The Impossible Will Take a Little While." And it was told by Sonia Tinsley Hook to the author of it. And she says, "Every day presents infinite reasons to believe that change cannot happen. Infinite reasons to give up. But I always tell myself, Sonia, you have to pick your team. It seems to me that there are two teams in this world, and you can find evidence to support the arguments of both. The trademark of one team is cynicism. They'll tell you why what you're doing doesn't matter, why nothing is ever going to change, why no matter how hard you work, you are going to fail. They seem to get satisfaction out of explaining how we'll always have injustice. You can't change human nature, they say, and it's just foolish to try. And from their experience, perhaps they're right. But there's another group of people who admit that they don't know how things will turn out, but they have decided to work for change," she says. "They're always telling stories of faith being rewarded, of ways things could be different, of how their own lives have been changed, and they'll give you reasons why you shouldn't give up, testimonials why we haven't seen our full potential as a species. They believe that we're partners in God's creation and that change is really possible." Then she concludes, "If I'm going to stick with somebody, I'd rather stick with the people who have a sense of possibility and hope. I just know that's the side I want to be on." So, people of faith, it's time. It's time to hear a different voice in the midst of the noise that constantly surrounds us. Now, hearing this voice is not to deny the existence of the struggle. The struggle is real. No, giving heed to this voice is choosing to live into the hope that God found, that can be found in the resurrected Christ. We, as people of faith, are called to live into this different tune. We are called to see a way even when there seems to be no way. And then we are called to have the courage to live into it. So in our noisy world, may we have the courage to listen to a different voice calling out to us. May we look at the witness of the lives of those who have gone before us that give us testimony to the activity of a covenantal God. And may we live lives that prove to be a song in the desert and a light to all people, pointing them to the all-encompassing grace of God. Amen.